By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was gasping under the pressure of a world determined to see it fall. The Allied advance from the west and the Soviet juggernaut from the east had turned Germany into a battlefield of desperation. Cities lay in ruins, factories were rubble, and the once disciplined Wehrmacht struggled to hold what remained of its territory. For the soldiers on the front lines, the war had ceased to be about victory, it was about survival, about holding the line long enough to see another day, another hour, another breath. Captain Heinrich Vogel of the 9th Panzer Division remembered the morning the artillery fire began. The sky above Aachen was a swirling gray, punctuated by the whistle of incoming shells. Soldiers crouched in bombed-out streets, eyes scanning the horizon for shadows of tanks, for the glint of steel helmets. He recalled later that there was a strange silence before the first volley, a kind of anticipatory calm that precedes catastrophe. The Wehrmacht, once confident and well-supplied, now relied on what little fuel, ammunition, and manpower they could scrounge. Ersatz soldiers, barely trained, were thrown into lines alongside battle-hardened veterans. Many of them were teenagers, barely men, their uniforms oversized and their eyes wide with fear. Yet they were expected to fight, to stand, to die if necessary. From above, the sky was a kaleidoscope of Allied bombers, their engines roaring as they dropped tons of explosives on rail depots, ammunition dumps, and bridges. The Wehrmacht's anti-aircraft batteries blazed, a futile attempt to assert control over the heavens. In some towns, civilians fled, hiding in cellars while the soldiers did their best to mount defenses. In others, the bombardment was so relentless that life itself seemed suspended, as if the world were holding its breath. Heinrich's unit had been ordered to defend a small industrial town near the Rhine. The order was simple: hold at all costs. But there was no clarity on what all costs meant. No reinforcements would come. No relief was expected. The men of his company dug trenches in frozen soil, using whatever tools they could find, piling sandbags over ruined walls. They huddled together at night, sharing scraps of bread, smoking the last cigarettes they had, and listening to the distant thrum of artillery that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. The soldiers wrote letters when they could, though many suspected the war would end before the words reached anyone. Private Karl Lehmann, a 19-year-old conscript from Bavaria, scribbled to his mother, "We fight for nothing, but the promise of tomorrow which may not come. The snow is red with mud and blood, and yet we march." Letters like Karl's captured the fragile humanity of the Wehrmacht in its final phase. Men and boys trapped in a machine far beyond their control, forced to execute orders they barely understood, praying for mercy from both the enemy and fate. The Germans were not invincible. The Allies knew this. Patton's Third Army tore through the Ardennes, leaving villages and forests scarred by the movement of tanks and troops. In the east, the Red Army pressed relentlessly towards Berlin, their numbers overwhelming, their momentum unstoppable. The Wehrmacht's once formidable divisions were now fractured, sometimes fighting on two fronts simultaneously, their supply lines broken, their morale eroding. Yet even in the chaos, discipline persisted. Commanders, aware that the Reich was collapsing, attempted to impose order. Maps were drawn on walls. Radio communications sent orders for counterattacks that often arrived too late or not at all. The logistics of defense became almost comical. Soldiers scavenging abandoned trucks for fuel, filling artillery shells with makeshift explosives, improvising signals with pieces of wire and scrap metal. And yet, despite the absurdity, they obeyed, clinging to routine as if adherence could stave off the inevitable. In December 1944, the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, became a last desperate gamble. Hitler hoped to split the Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Thousands of German soldiers, many conscript, were thrown into snow-laden forests, facing frostbite, starvation, and relentless American counterattacks. Communication lines froze, command was fragmented, and panic spread as units became isolated. Yet the soldiers fought with a grim determination, driven less by ideology than by fear, honor, or the simple instinct to survive. Heinrich remembered the first night of the offensive vividly. The forest was silent, but for the occasional snapping of branches under the weight of troops. Snow fell thickly, muting sounds, concealing movements. The soldiers pressed forward, cold seeping into bones, yet every man carried a rifle. Every man understood the stakes. Villages burned in the distance, civilians caught in the crossfire. Yet the Wehrmacht advanced, step by step, against overwhelming odds. As winter deepened, supplies ran out. Soldiers scavenged from the fallen, rationed the last drops of water, and wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of clothing they could find. Some turned to prayer, some to alcohol, some to quiet despair. Many letters, diaries, and later memoirs recount these moments, the juxtaposition of courage and futility, heroism and tragedy. Despite the collapse above ground, some units retained cohesion. General Field Marshal Model coordinated defensive lines along the Rhine, attempting to stabilize a front that no longer existed. Yet the relentless pressure from both east and west meant that every victory was temporary, every strategic maneuver reactive, and every human cost immense. By late January 1945, the Wehrmacht's front lines had been pushed back hundreds of kilometers. Cities were reduced to rubble. Thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Yet in isolated pockets, resistance continued. Men who had no orders left, units cut off from command, yet unwilling to surrender. In these moments, the essence of the Wehrmacht's final stand manifested, a mixture of discipline, desperation, fear, and the haunting desire to maintain honor even in defeat. In one small town near the Rhine, Heinrich Vogel's unit faced a night assault by American infantry. Snowflakes fell in sheets, masking the enemy's approach. Men huddled in ruined buildings, rifles at ready, listening for the faint crunch of boots on frozen earth. Then came the first shots, sudden and sharp, echoing through broken streets. The firefight was chaotic. Soldiers called out coordinates, fired blindly from windows and rubble, and tried to cover one another as the Americans advanced house to house. Heinrich remembered seeing a young private, barely 17, fall in the snow. There was no time for mourning. Another comrade dragged him to cover, the blood soaking through his mittens. Hours later, the town was a shambles. Fires raged, smoke choked the air, and bodies lay in the snow. Heinrich's unit had held the line, but at tremendous cost. That night, as they counted the living and the dead, the reality settled in. Germany was crumbling. The orders were meaningless. The front lines were imaginary. All that remained was endurance. Amid the chaos, soldiers formed impromptu bonds. A medic named Otto Fischer moved tirelessly between wounded comrades, applying bandages, administering morphine, whispering reassurances that none could hear over gunfire. These moments of humanity shone briefly against the overwhelming brutality of war. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced steadily. Town after town fell. Rail lines were destroyed, bridges demolished, factories looted or obliterated. The Wehrmacht's strategy was no longer offensive, but simply delaying the inevitable. Soldiers were trained to retreat methodically, to deny resources to the enemy, to make every step backward costly. Yet every step back meant exposure to artillery, frostbite, hunger, and despair. By February 1945, reports from the front indicated that the Wehrmacht had lost half its operational strength. Infantry divisions were skeletal. Armored units existed mostly on paper, with a few tanks scavenged from destroyed depots. Supply convoys were vulnerable to air attacks. Communication lines were fractured, and morale plummeted. Yet the command insisted on holding positions, and soldiers obeyed. In letters discovered decades later, Heinrich wrote, "We fight not for victory, but because the alternative is death. Every morning we rise rifle in hand, knowing that tomorrow may be our last, yet somehow we persist." Such persistence defined the collapse above ground, a mixture of courage, loyalty, and survival instinct. And as the Wehrmacht retreated, scattered units made temporary stands, fortified ruins, and held choke points to slow the Allied advance. In one particularly brutal engagement in the Hurtgen forest, soldiers faced not only the enemy, but the terrain itself. Dense woods, freezing temperatures, and mud-clogged boots turned every movement into a struggle. The Americans advanced through the forest with tanks and artillery, while German defenders utilized camouflaged bunkers, machine gun nests, and improvised traps. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the Wehrmacht's defensive tactics allowed small units to delay entire divisions, buying time for retreating comrades. Civilian populations were caught in the middle. Refugees fled the forests, carrying children, livestock, and memories of towns now reduced to ruins. Soldiers occasionally provided aid, sharing rations, directing escape routes, or sheltering families. But for many, survival meant cold pragmatism. The war had stripped away idealism, leaving only raw instinct. As spring approached, the Wehrmacht situation became critical. Communications from Berlin were sporadic, fuel was almost non-existent, and soldiers often scavenged abandoned vehicles and supplies. The reality was that Hitler's command structure was disintegrating as his orders persisted. Units were instructed to hold territory without reinforcements, defend towns against overwhelming numbers, and the Wehrmacht's final strongholds were not cities of grandeur, but strategic positions, mountains, and ruined towns where survival dictated the terms of battle. Berlin became the epicenter, a city under siege from the Red Army. Soldiers entrenched in the ruins of government buildings, factories, and underground bunkers fought block by block. Streets were transformed into killing fields, and the civilians who remained were trapped between artillery and ideology. Colonel Franz Müller commanded one of the last cohesive units defending the northern sector. His men had lost 2/3 of their number in previous engagements. Supplies were scarce, and communication with other sectors was erratic. Yet he organized what remained with meticulous precision. They fortified cellars, stacked rubble as barricades, and mined streets with what little explosives they had. Every move was calculated to maximize the impact of limited manpower. The battle was apocalyptic. Soviet tanks rumbled down crumbling boulevards, infantry swept through the streets, and artillery shells reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Müller's unit fought with determination, repelling several assaults, but the cost was catastrophic. By the third week of April, he had lost nearly half his remaining men. Meanwhile, in the Alps, German units prepared defensive positions in anticipation of an Allied push. General Oberst Eduard Dietl oversaw fortifications in mountain passes, bunkers carved into cliffs, and hidden artillery emplacements. Soldiers adapted to harsh terrain, using snow, ice, and rock to their advantage. Communication was difficult, but localized leadership allowed units to operate semi-independently. Here, the war slowed to brutal attrition. Small skirmishes, sniper fire, and the constant threat of avalanches or frostbite. Soldiers faced moral dilemmas as well. Many had been drafted from conquered territories or occupied nations and were forced to fight against both Allied forces and insurgent resistance groups. Desertion was common, yet the threat of summary execution prevented most from abandoning their posts. Loyalty became entangled with fear, ideology, and the instinct to survive. In smaller towns and isolated villages, pockets of Wehrmacht troops continued to resist long after central command had ceased to function. They scavenged supplies, commandeered abandoned vehicles, and maintained rudimentary lines of defense. Some engaged in guerrilla tactics, while others surrendered only after exhausting every possible means of defense. The human cost was staggering. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal the psychological toll: insomnia, despair, hallucinations, and the burden of witnessing death daily. Soldiers who survived often described the final weeks as a liminal state, existing between life and death, hope and inevitability. The Battle of Berlin was a citywide inferno. Flames licked the facades of government buildings, smoke choked streets, and rubble became both shield and trap. Soldiers like Captain Heinrich Vogel moved cautiously through alleys, clearing rooms, coordinating with other units by runners since radios were destroyed or intercepted. In the subterranean metro tunnels, entire companies took refuge, turning abandoned stations into fortresses. Every corner concealed danger: snipers, advancing tanks, or collapsing ceilings. Despite hopeless circumstances, the soldiers maintained discipline. Orders from high command were often nonsensical, yet following them gave structure to chaos. Lieutenant Karl Steiner recalled carrying wounded men block by block through frozen streets while artillery pummeled the city overhead. Civilians, desperate and terrified, relied on the same soldiers for protection, forming strange bonds between fighters and non-combatants. As the Red Army closed in, desperation became palpable. Soldiers consumed all rations, including melted snow, rotting canned food, and whatever livestock they could find. Ammunition ran low, forcing men to salvage bullets from dead comrades or abandoned depots, yet they continued to hold key positions: bridges, intersections, and tunnels, delaying the inevitable advance. Meanwhile, in the Alps, isolated Wehrmacht units held mountain passes. General Oberst Eduard Diedel's forces engaged in a war of attrition, using hidden bunkers and narrow defiles to slow Allied movement. Snowstorms provided cover, but also claimed lives. Frostbite and exhaustion were constant companions. Supply lines were tenuous at best. A single misstep could result in death. Despite these conditions, soldiers adapted, using local terrain knowledge, improvised traps, and guerrilla tactics to maintain resistance. Elsewhere, German units in the Ruhr and Bavaria attempted to defend cities using cobbled-together militias, Volkssturm units, and experienced officers. Often these forces were outnumbered 10-1, yet they fought to protect civilians and buy time for evacuations. The Wehrmacht's final defensive efforts were not just about ideology or orders. They were about survival, the instinct to protect family, community, and whatever remained of their world. Even as collapse neared, soldiers recorded their experiences in diaries and letters. One young private, Wilhelm Fischer, wrote, "We know the Reich is falling, yet we hold. Each day is a battle with the earth, with fear, and with ourselves. We fight not because we believe, but because there is nothing else left." These personal accounts reveal the human dimension of the Wehrmacht's final defense: fear, courage, despair, and fleeting hope intertwined in every step, every shot, and every frozen night. By April 25, 1945, Berlin was nearly encircled. Soviet artillery breached the outer districts, forcing German units into the city center. Supplies were exhausted, morale collapsed in many sectors. Soldiers faced impossible choices: fight and die, surrender and face the unknown, or attempt escape through rubble-strewn streets. Even in the face of inevitable defeat, pockets of resistance continued, creating a city of isolated battles within battles. By the time the Red Army reached the Reichstag, German soldiers were exhausted physically and emotionally. Their uniforms were tattered, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Hunger gnawed at them, frostbite crippled some, and fear haunted every step. Yet orders compelled them to defend positions at all costs. Captain Heinrich Vogel witnessed the destruction firsthand. Street after street was reduced to rubble. Fires raged in the remnants of apartment blocks. Civilians huddled in basements, sharing rations with soldiers when possible. Each encounter blurred the line between combatant and civilian. Everyone was part of the same struggle for survival. Inside the Reichstag itself, defenders barricaded doors with furniture and debris. Snipers occupied windows. Mortar fire from the Soviets shattered the stained glass, sending shards into the halls. Soldiers whispered prayers, recited poems, or wrote final letters, knowing many would never see home again. In the Alps, German mountain units faced starvation and isolation. Lieutenant Hans Meyer described nights spent listening to the wind howl through frozen passes, while distant artillery reminded them that war existed beyond their frozen encampment. Soldiers hunted small game, melted snow for water, and shared rations carefully. Morale was maintained not by ideology, but by camaraderie and sheer will.
Some units attempted breakout maneuvers to link up with other Wehrmacht formations, but roads were mined, bridges destroyed, and Allied patrols everywhere. Escape often meant death or capture. In these desperate conditions, soldiers displayed remarkable ingenuity, constructing sleds for supplies, disguising positions, and improvising weapons from remnants of artillery and vehicles. Even civilians became actors in the last defense. Townspeople hid soldiers, transported wounded, or helped carry messages. Children were sometimes sent to safer regions, while elderly citizens dug trenches, reinforced barricades, or assisted in maintaining defensive positions. The war became a total effort, a collective act of survival amidst devastation. In the diaries discovered decades later, soldiers describe moral crises, orders to execute prisoners, to burn villages, or to sacrifice themselves for strategic points. Some obeyed, others refused and faced immediate execution. Yet these small acts of defiance and humanity punctuated the overarching narrative of destruction. The Battle of Berlin culminated in isolated last stands, soldiers fighting block by block in near darkness. Ammunition was rationed, water scarce, and fatigue pervasive. Officers improvised, assigning squads to barricade entrances, establish sniper positions, and create traps from rubble. The city became a labyrinth of death, a microcosm of the Wehrmacht's collapse across Germany. By May 2, 1945, organized resistance in Berlin ceased. Surviving soldiers surrendered, escaped, or were captured. In the Alps and isolated pockets of the Reich, small units continued resistance until the last days of May. Everywhere, the pattern repeated: exhaustion, improvisation, fleeting courage, and eventual surrender.
The surrender of the Wehrmacht marked the end of Hitler's final defense, but its legacy endured in survivors, ruins, and historical memory. Soldiers returned home physically intact in some cases, broken in spirit in most. Many faced imprisonment, denazification, or social ostracism. Civilians emerged from bombed cities, mourning the dead and rebuilding amidst rubble. Historians later pieced together accounts from diaries, letters, and reports. They revealed not just strategic failures, but human experiences. Soldiers improvising defenses, civilians risking lives, and the moral dilemmas faced under extreme conditions. The Wehrmacht's final stand was less about ideology than the human instinct to endure against overwhelming odds. In Germany, towns preserved ruins as reminders, while some Alpine bunkers remained inaccessible for decades. Memoirs recounted individual heroism, tragic mistakes, and ethical choices under fire. Former soldiers described nights of terror, day-long marches, and the horror of combat against overwhelming numbers. The lessons of the last stand extended beyond history books. Military analysts studied defensive strategies under extreme conditions. Psychologists explored the effects of prolonged combat, isolation, and moral conflict. Sociologists examined civilian participation and survival under occupation. Decades later, the story of the Wehrmacht's last months continues to resonate. It is a testament to the extremes of human endurance, the moral complexities of warfare, and the ultimate cost of blind obedience. From Berlin's rubble to the icy Alpine passes, the last soldiers of the Reich fought not for ideology, but because it was all that remained between them and annihilation. Even today, historians explore the ruins, rediscover diaries, and walk the forests and streets where the final defenders held their lines. The echoes of the Wehrmacht's last stand remind the world that history is not merely dates and battles. It is lived experience, human courage, despair, and the haunting consequences of total war.